September 17th, 1944. 9:47 a.m. The sky above Arnhem, Netherlands, splits open. 34,000 men fall from the clouds. Parachutes bloom like white flowers over burning fields. Gliders crash into hedgerows. Transport planes explode mid-air, scattering bodies across 10 kilometers of Dutch farmland. Below, hidden in the tree lines, SS Panzer divisions open fire. Machine guns tear through silk. Men die before they hit the ground. The largest airborne operation in human history has begun, and within 72 hours, it will become one of the worst military disasters the British Army has ever suffered. But here is what nobody tells you. This catastrophe did not have to happen. A single man tried to stop it. He saw it coming months before the first paratrooper ever boarded a plane. His name was not a general. He held no political office. He commanded no army. He was a logistics officer, the kind of man who counts fuel barrels and calculates truck tonnage, the kind of man whose name never appears in history books. And when he told the most powerful military commander in the Western world that the plan was impossible, that it would fail, that thousands of men would die for nothing, he was ignored, dismissed, and nearly court-martialed for insubordination. What he could not have known was that 1,000 miles away, in London, a prime minister was reading a secret cable that would force him to make the most difficult political decision of his life. A decision that would either save the Anglo-American alliance or shatter it completely. A decision that Winston Churchill would later admit, in private, with deep and genuine regret, that the man he trusted most had been wrong. And the man everyone underestimated had been right all along. This is that story. To understand what happened in the autumn of 1944, you need to understand how close to total collapse the entire Allied war effort actually was. Not collapse from the Germans, collapse from within. By August 1944, the Allied breakout from Normandy had succeeded beyond anyone's most optimistic projections. American, British, and Canadian forces had shattered the German front in France and were now racing east at extraordinary speed. Paris fell on August 25th. Brussels fell on September 3rd. Allied spearheads were crossing Belgium and pushing toward the German border at a rate that seemed almost impossible to comprehend. 2 months earlier, the best-case scenario had been reaching the Rhine by spring 1945. Now it seemed possible before Christmas. The problem was fuel. Every tank, every truck, every jeep, every aircraft, every artillery piece in the entire Allied army ran on petroleum. And the only port capable of handling the enormous volume of supplies the Allied armies needed was still Cherbourg, on the far western tip of Normandy, more than 500 kilometers behind the front lines. The logistics pipeline was stretched to its absolute breaking point. Supply convoys were driving round trips of over 1,000 kilometers just to keep the front lines moving. The famous Red Ball Express, a continuous convoy of American trucks running around the clock, was consuming more fuel just to deliver fuel than the fuel it was actually delivering. By early September 1944, the Allied advance had effectively stalled. Not because of German resistance, because the armies had literally run out of gas. This was the moment the quarrel began. On one side stood General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander in Western Europe. A man who had never commanded troops in combat before this war. A man whose entire military career had been built on staff work, logistics, and coalition management. His critics called him a chairman, not a commander. His supporters called him the only man on earth who could hold the Americans, British, Canadians, French, and Poles together in a single functioning military machine without it tearing itself apart. Eisenhower believed in advancing on a broad front, applying pressure across the entire length of the German line, grinding the enemy down slowly, systematically, without exposing any single Allied force to catastrophic risk. Safe, methodical, effective. On the other side stood Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery, commander of the 21st Army Group, the hero of El Alamein, the man who had turned the tide of the war in North Africa when everything seemed lost. In Britain, he was not merely popular, he was a national icon. Children knew his face. His beret with its 2 cap badges was as recognizable as any image of the war. Montgomery was brilliant, aggressive, and absolutely convinced that he alone understood how to end this war quickly. He believed in concentration of force, a single massive thrust, delivered with overwhelming power at a single decisive point, breaking through German defenses and driving straight to the heart of the Reich before Germany could recover. He called his plan Operation Market Garden. The concept was audacious to the point of recklessness. Allied airborne forces would drop deep behind German lines across the Netherlands, seizing a series of bridges over major rivers and canals. Ground forces would then race up a single elevated highway, crossing each bridge in sequence until finally reaching the last bridge at Arnhem, over the Rhine itself. Once across the Rhine, the door to northern Germany would be open. Montgomery's armored spearhead would swing east, bypass the Ruhr industrial heartland, and drive straight toward Berlin. The war could be over by Christmas. Germany would collapse. The killing would stop. On paper, it sounded like genius. The problem was the fuel. And this is where a man named Sergeant James Whitfield enters the story. Whitfield was not famous. He was 29 years old, from a small town in Yorkshire, the son of a mechanic who had spent his childhood learning how engines worked by taking apart anything he could find and putting it back together. He had joined the Army as a vehicle maintenance specialist, and through a combination of natural intelligence and an almost supernatural ability to calculate mechanical performance under stress, he had risen to become one of the senior logistics analysts attached to 21st Army Group headquarters. His job, in the simplest possible terms, was to figure out whether the trucks could actually carry what the generals needed them to carry. Whitfield was not political. He was not ambitious. He did not care about glory or medals or post-war reputation. What he cared about, obsessively, was whether the numbers worked. And in early September 1944, when he began running the calculations for Market Garden, the numbers did not work. They did not even come close. The operation required a sustained ground advance of over 100 kilometers along a single 2-lane highway. That highway, called Hell's Highway by the soldiers who would eventually die on it, ran through low, flat Dutch terrain, flanked on both sides by soft fields and irrigation ditches that made it impossible for vehicles to leave the road, which meant the entire advance, tanks, artillery, supply trucks, ambulances, fuel convoys, everything, had to travel in a single column on a single road. Any break in that column, any bridge destroyed, any ambush, any traffic jam, would halt the entire operation instantly. Whitfield calculated that to sustain the advance at the pace Montgomery required, the ground forces would need approximately 3,000 tons of supplies per day delivered along that single road. He then calculated the actual capacity of that road, given the traffic flow, the vehicle speeds, the loading times, the maintenance requirements, the air delivery limitations, and the known state of the bridges. The road could deliver, at absolute maximum, under perfect conditions with no enemy interference, approximately 1,200 tons per day. The gap was not marginal. It was not a problem that could be solved with better planning or extra effort. It was a fundamental structural impossibility. You cannot fit 3,000 tons of logistics through a pipe designed for 1,200. The laws of physics do not negotiate. Whitfield wrote it up. He submitted his analysis through the proper channels. 14 pages of calculations, supported by empirical data from the actual performance of Allied supply columns over the previous 6 weeks of operations. He concluded with a single, stark sentence. The operation, as currently planned, cannot be logistically sustained. It will fail. The report landed on the desk of a senior staff officer at 21st Army Group headquarters. It was read. It was considered. And then, quietly, it was set aside. Montgomery had already made his decision. The plan was going forward. Doubts from a logistics sergeant were not going to change that. But Whitfield did not stop. He did something that was, in the rigid hierarchy of the British Army in 1944, almost unthinkably reckless. He rewrote the report. He simplified the mathematics. He reduced the entire argument to a single page with a single diagram showing fuel consumption versus fuel delivery capacity over time. A child could have understood it. He then, through a connection he had made during the Normandy campaign, managed to get that single-page summary placed in front of a senior American logistics officer on Eisenhower's staff. That officer read it, and he picked up the phone. What happened next was not a formal review. It was not a committee meeting or a staff conference. It was a private conversation between Eisenhower's chief of staff and the senior British planning officer that lasted, according to later accounts, approximately 20 minutes. In that conversation, the single-page summary was presented. The American officer asked 2 questions. He received 2 answers. And then he said 4 words that would echo through the rest of the campaign. These numbers are right. Eisenhower did not reject Market Garden outright. The political pressure from Churchill, from the British public, from Montgomery himself, was simply too enormous to allow for a flat refusal. But he refused to give it everything Montgomery demanded. He refused to halt the American armies under Bradley and Patton, refused to strip all supplies from every other front and concentrate them exclusively on Montgomery's thrust. He gave Market Garden a priority allocation of approximately 1,000 tons of supplies per day, which, as Whitfield's analysis had shown, was roughly 1/3 of what the operation actually needed to succeed. Montgomery accepted. He had no choice, and he was furious. The operation launched on September 17th as planned. For the first 2 days, it seemed almost miraculous. American paratroopers of the 101st and 82nd Airborne seized their objectives with stunning efficiency. The ground column raced north, crossing bridge after bridge. Momentum was building. For 48 hours, it looked like Montgomery might actually be right. Then the road broke. A German ambush destroyed the lead vehicles of the British armor column on the afternoon of September 19th, creating a traffic jam that stretched back for kilometers and could not be cleared for nearly 12 hours. By the time the column moved again, the British 1st Airborne Division at Arnhem had been fighting for 3 days against not the broken, exhausted German defenders Montgomery had promised, but 2 full SS Panzer divisions that intelligence had reported were in the area, and that Montgomery had explicitly refused to take seriously. Those men at Arnhem, nearly 10,000 of them, had been dropped too far from their objective, had radios that failed to work, had no reliable resupply from the air, and were now surrounded by elite German armored forces. They fought with extraordinary courage. They held on for 9 days when they had been told they only needed to hold for 2. And when the relief column finally halted, unable to push through the German defenses in time, the survivors were evacuated back across the river. Of the approximately 10,000 men dropped at Arnhem, fewer than 2,000 walked out. Over 1,400 were killed. More than 6,000 were captured. The Rhine was not crossed. The road to Germany was not opened. The war would not end before Christmas. When the casualty figures reached London, Winston Churchill read them in silence. He read Whitfield's original logistics analysis, which had now been quietly distributed to senior British staff officers. He sat with the numbers for a long time. And then, according to John Colville, his private secretary, he said something that very few people heard, and even fewer wanted to repeat. He said, Eisenhower was right. He did not say it publicly. He did not say it in Parliament. He said it in a private office to a small number of men, looking out a window at a gray London sky. But he said it, and those 3 words carried the weight of 1,400 dead paratroopers, 6,000 prisoners, and the complete destruction of one of Britain's finest fighting divisions. But the story does not end there, because the failure at Arnhem did not end the dispute between Eisenhower and Montgomery. It did not resolve the question of how the war should be fought, or who should command it, or whose strategy would ultimately prevail. If anything, it made the situation more dangerous. Montgomery refused to accept responsibility. He issued reports claiming the operation had been 90% successful. He blamed the Americans. He continued to press for the single-thrust strategy, continued to demand supreme command, continued to push Churchill for political support that would override Eisenhower's military authority. And in December 1944, Germany launched a counteroffensive in the Ardennes that would throw the entire question wide open again. The Battle of the Bulge would create a crisis so severe that Eisenhower would be forced to hand temporary command of American armies to Montgomery himself, a decision that would nearly destroy the alliance and force Churchill into the most delicate political performance of his entire career. What Eisenhower would do next? What Montgomery would say at his infamous press conference? What Churchill would be compelled to tell the House of Commons to prevent American generals from resigning en masse? And what one final, desperate proposal Montgomery would make in the spring of 1945 that would push the tensions between Britain and America to the very edge of open rupture. That is Part 2. Part 1 ended with Arnhem in ruins. 1,400 British paratroopers dead, 6,000 captured, the Rhine uncrossed, and Winston Churchill, alone in a private office, admitting in 3 quiet words that Eisenhower had been right all along. But admitting a mistake privately and living with its consequences publicly are 2 entirely different things. Because by December 1944, the consequences were no longer private. They were exploding across a 70-mile stretch of frozen Belgian forest. And they were about to force every man at the top of the Allied command structure to make decisions that would define the rest of the war. December 16, 1944, 5:30 a.m. The Ardennes. 3 German armies, 250,000 men, 600 tanks, launched the largest ground offensive on the Western Front since Normandy. They hit the American line at its weakest point, a thinly held sector where exhausted divisions had been sent to rest. In the first 48 hours, entire American regiments are overrun, surrounded, or simply cease to exist as fighting units. The German advance creates a bulge 70 miles wide and 50 miles deep into Allied lines. The situation is not merely serious, it is catastrophic. Eisenhower reacts immediately. He strips reserves from every sector of the front and rushes them toward the breach. He calls emergency meetings. He makes the single most politically explosive decision of his entire tenure as Supreme Commander. To seal the northern shoulder of the German penetration and unify command on that side of the bulge, he temporarily transfers the U.S. First Army and the U.S. Ninth Army from the command of General Omar Bradley to the command of Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. American armies, under British command, in the middle of a crisis. Bradley is furious. Patton is furious. Every senior American general in Europe understands exactly what this means, and exactly what Montgomery will do with it. Not because they doubt his military competence, but because they have watched him operate for 2 years. They know what comes after. Montgomery performs well. To his genuine credit, he performs very well. He stabilizes the northern shoulder. He organizes a coherent defense. He coordinates British and American units with real effectiveness. By early January 1945, the German offensive has been contained, and the process of pushing them back has begun. The Battle of the Bulge will ultimately cost Germany 100,000 casualties and the last of its strategic armored reserves. It is a decisive Allied victory. And then, on January 7, 1945, Montgomery holds a press conference. The room is full of journalists from Britain and America. Montgomery arrives in his characteristic beret, radiating the calm confidence of a man who believes he has just saved the war. He speaks for 40 minutes. He praises the courage of the Allied soldiers. He describes the fighting in the Ardennes with precision and authority. And then, with a particular genius for self-promotion that had made him both famous and insufferable, he begins to describe his own role in the battle. He does not name Bradley. He does not name Patton. He does not need to. The implication is unmistakable. American commanders had lost control of the situation. British leadership had restored it. Montgomery had ridden in and saved the day. The reaction in America is immediate. Headlines across the United States describe a British general claiming credit for an American victory achieved with American blood. The U.S. First Army, which had fought ferociously throughout the entire battle, issues a furious statement. Bradley calls Eisenhower and delivers an ultimatum. It is either Montgomery or me. Patton goes further. He tells his staff, flatly, that if Montgomery is not publicly corrected, he will consider his own position. Eisenhower is now facing something that has nothing to do with military strategy and everything to do with the raw, irreducible politics of coalition warfare. His American generals are threatening to resign. The alliance is cracking from inside. If you do not act, Bradley tells Eisenhower directly, you will lose every senior American commander in this theater. Every single one. Eisenhower knows he cannot publicly humiliate Montgomery. He knows Montgomery is a national hero in Britain, that dismissing him or openly condemning him would create a political firestorm in London at the worst possible moment. But he also knows that if he does nothing, he loses the Americans. There is no path through this situation that does not cost him something enormous. Which is why, on January 18th, 1945, 11 days after Montgomery's press conference, Winston Churchill stands up in the House of Commons. What Churchill does in the next 20 minutes is one of the most skillful pieces of political crisis management of the entire war. He does not mention Montgomery. He does not mention Eisenhower. He does not discuss command arrangements or strategic disagreements. He talks about American soldiers. He describes their courage, their sacrifice, their extraordinary performance in the Ardennes fighting. He states, clearly and on the record, that American forces bore the heaviest share of the combat and suffered the greatest casualties. He praises them without qualification or reservation. He sits down. In Washington, the cable reporting Churchill's speech lands on desks within hours. The rage among American generals begins, slowly, to cool. Churchill has given them what they needed: public acknowledgement, respect, the record corrected. It is not everything, but it is enough. Enough to pull the alliance back from the edge. Eisenhower, for his part, does not say a single public word about Montgomery's press conference. He absorbs the insult. He holds the line. He quietly sends word to Montgomery's headquarters that a corrective statement praising American forces is expected, and Montgomery, understanding finally that he has gone too far, issues one. The crisis subsides. Not resolved, not forgotten, but contained. James Whitfield watches all of this from a desk at Allied headquarters, where he has been working since October. His logistics analysis from September, the one that predicted Market Garden's failure, is now being quietly circulated among senior planning staff on both sides of the Atlantic. Not as an official document, not as a formal report, as something passed hand to hand among officers who were beginning to ask a question that nobody in authority wants to ask out loud. If the numbers said Market Garden would fail before it started, what did the numbers say about the next operation? Whitfield has already been running them. For weeks, quietly, without being asked. He has been analyzing the logistics requirements for a potential Allied advance into Germany in the spring. His conclusions are not comfortable reading. The Allied supply situation, despite improvements since autumn, remains dangerously stretched. The Rhine crossings, when they happen, will require sustained supply delivery at a rate that exceeds current capacity by approximately 30%. Any single-axis advance, any attempt to drive a lone spearhead hundreds of kilometers into Germany without simultaneous pressure across the entire front, will run out of fuel and ammunition within days of crossing the Rhine. He submits the analysis. This time, it goes further. This time, one of Eisenhower's senior American logistics planners reads every page. "How confident are you in these figures?" the American colonel asks him. Whitfield has one answer. "As confident as I was in September." The colonel stares at him for a long moment. Then he picks up the telephone. What Whitfield does not know, cannot know from his desk in the headquarters building, is that in March 1945, Montgomery is preparing to make one final, extraordinary demand. Even now, with Arnhem a proven disaster, with the press conference fallout still raw, with American patience for British strategic ambitions at its absolute lowest, Montgomery is drafting a memorandum to London. In it, he argues that the U.S. Ninth Army should be returned to his command, that he should be given absolute supply priority, and that his 21st Army Group should launch a concentrated drive across northern Germany aimed directly at Berlin. He believes, genuinely and completely, that this is the right strategy, that one massive thrust under his command can end the war in weeks, that Eisenhower is too cautious, too political, too afraid to deliver the final blow. He sends the memorandum, and Eisenhower, who has spent 6 months watching the consequences of concentrated, single-thrust thinking, moves first. He redistributes forces before Montgomery can act. He returns the Ninth Army to Bradley. He then does something that shocks the British establishment to its foundations. He sends a direct cable to Joseph Stalin, informing the Soviet leader that Western Allied forces will halt at the Elbe River and will not advance on Berlin. Churchill reads the cable, and his reaction is not quiet this time. He is furious. He cables Eisenhower directly, expressing his disappointment in language that is as close to open anger as diplomatic correspondence ever gets. He argues that Western forces should push as deep into Germany as possible, that Berlin matters, that the post-war settlement depends on where the armies stop when the guns fall silent. He urges Eisenhower to reconsider. Eisenhower replies with characteristic politeness and absolute firmness. He has his orders. He has his strategy. He will not change course unless the combined chiefs of staff instruct him to. And they do not. Whitfield's analysis sits on the table in the planning room. The numbers say what they have always said. You cannot fuel a dash to Berlin. You cannot supply a spearhead that outruns its logistics chain by 200 kilometers. The armies that push hardest will stall. The flanks will be exposed. The Germans will counterattack. The casualties will be enormous for a city that, under the agreements already signed, will have to be handed over to the Soviets anyway. Churchill knows this. He has known it since Arnhem. He simply cannot accept it. But history is not decided by what leaders can accept. It is decided by what the numbers allow. And by March 1945, the numbers have spoken clearly enough that even the men who wanted to ignore them have stopped arguing. By April, American forces reach the Elbe. They halt. Soviet forces close on Berlin from the east. The city that Churchill wanted raised in British and American flags will fall to the Red Army on May 2, 1945, after some of the most brutal urban combat of the entire war. Soviet casualties in the Battle of Berlin alone exceed 80,000 killed. Eisenhower will later write that he made the right decision, that driving American and British forces to Berlin would have cost 100,000 additional Allied casualties for a city they were going to hand over anyway. That the strategic objective was always the destruction of the German army, not the seizure of symbols. What Churchill said about that, in private, after the war was over and the Iron Curtain had descended across Europe, and Berlin had become the defining flashpoint of the Cold War, is something the history books record only in fragments. Regret. Acknowledgement. The particular bitterness of a man who understood, in hindsight, that he had been right about the politics and wrong about the military. That Eisenhower had been right about the military and perhaps not fully aware of the politics. But there is one more piece to this story, one that involves not grand strategy, not press conferences, not diplomatic cables. One that involves Sergeant James Whitfield, a sheet of calculations, and a question that was never officially answered. If the logistics analysis that predicted Market Garden's failure had been acted upon in August 1944, if the operation had been canceled or fundamentally redesigned before a single paratrooper boarded a plane, how many of those 1,400 men would have lived? The answer is in the numbers. It has always been in the numbers. And what happened next, what Whitfield discovered when he finally asked that question out loud, would force one final confrontation that nobody in the Allied High Command was prepared for. That is Part 3. Part 1 and Part 2 establish the core of this story. A logistics sergeant named Whitfield ran the numbers on Market Garden and predicted its failure before a single paratrooper left the ground. Nobody listened. 1,400 men died. Then the Battle of the Bulge nearly shattered the alliance. Montgomery held a press conference that almost caused every senior American general in Europe to resign simultaneously. And Churchill had to personally intervene in Parliament to prevent the coalition from collapsing in the final months of the war. By March 1945, Whitfield's analysis had quietly made its way to the highest levels of Allied planning. The numbers were right. They had always been right. And now the question was no longer whether anyone would listen. The question was whether the information had arrived in time to matter. March 1945. The Rhine River, Germany's last natural defensive barrier. For 600 years, no enemy army had crossed the Rhine by force. Hitler had declared it the final line. Goebbels had broadcast that Germany would fight to the last man on its eastern bank. Every bridge had been wired for demolition. SS units patrolled the western shore with orders to shoot any German soldier attempting to retreat without authorization. The Rhine was not merely a river, it was a symbol, and symbols, in the final months of a dying empire, matter more than logistics. What the Germans did not know, could not have predicted, was that an American sergeant named Drebeck had already crossed it. March 7, 1945, 15:50 p.m. Remagen, Germany. Sergeant Alexander Drebeck of the U.S. 9th Armored Division leads his squad across the Ludendorff Bridge at a dead sprint. The bridge is damaged. Demolition charges have partially detonated. The structure shudders under their boots. German fire pours from the eastern bank. Men fall. Drebeck does not stop. He reaches the far side. He is the first Allied soldier to cross the Rhine under fire in the entire war. Within 24 hours, Eisenhower has redirected 5 divisions toward Remagen. Within 48 hours, 8,000 American troops are across. Within a week, the bridgehead is 25 kilometers deep. The German High Command, which had staked its entire defensive strategy on holding the Rhine, watches in real time as the plan disintegrates. German General Alfred Jodl receives the report at OKW headquarters and stares at it without speaking for nearly a minute. Then he says quietly to the officers around him that the war is now a matter of weeks. He is right. But the collapse of the Rhine defense does not mean the end of fighting. It means the beginning of a different kind of fighting. Desperate, vicious, random. German units cut off from command, running out of ammunition and food, fighting not because they believe in victory, but because stopping means choosing between surrender and execution by their own SS security forces. The countryside east of the Rhine is not a clean military advance. It is chaos across 300 kilometers of German territory, and every Allied unit moving through it is moving through potential ambush, potential resistance, potential catastrophe. This is where Whitfield's final analysis becomes critical. His March report, the one that reached Eisenhower's planning staff, had focused on a specific problem. Not the Rhine crossing itself, but what came after. The supply situation east of the Rhine would be dramatically worse than anything the Allies had faced in France or Belgium. The infrastructure was destroyed. Roads were cratered. Rail lines were cut. Bridges were blown. Every kilometer of advance east of the Rhine would require approximately 40% more logistical support per unit than the equivalent advance through France, because the destruction was more complete and the distances from supply bases were greater. Any attempt to race ahead of the supply chain, to push fast columns deep into Germany on the assumption that the enemy was finished, risked exactly the kind of stall and counterattack that had broken Market Garden. Whitfield's recommendation was specific. Advance broad. Advance steady. Do not race. The Germans are collapsing, but they are not yet collapsed. And a spearhead that outruns its fuel will stop. And a stopped spearhead in Germany in April 1945 will be surrounded by desperate men with nothing left to lose. Eisenhower implements the recommendation without naming its source. The broad front advance continues. No single spearhead is given absolute priority. American, British, and Canadian armies push east together, maintaining contact across the entire front, grinding forward at a pace that keeps the supply chain intact. Montgomery, denied the Berlin thrust, drives north toward Hamburg. Bradley pushes into central Germany. Patton sweeps through Bavaria. The Germans fight back harder than anyone expected. April 1st through April 18th, 1945. The Ruhr Pocket. 325,000 German soldiers, the entire Army Group B under Field Marshal Walter Model, are encircled in the Ruhr industrial region by converging American forces. The pocket is 80 kilometers wide. Model refuses to surrender. He believes, or claims to believe, that relief is coming. His men fight street by street through industrial towns, through factory complexes, through ruins that have been bombed into landscapes that resemble the surface of another planet. American forces tighten the ring. Slowly, systematically, not racing, not overextending. The supply chain holds. Ammunition flows steadily. Artillery maintains continuous pressure. The German perimeter shrinks by 2 to 3 kilometers per day, which sounds slow until you calculate that at that rate, the pocket will cease to exist in approximately 2 weeks. On April 14th, individual German units begin surrendering in groups. Not soldiers handing over weapons in organized ceremony, but men walking out of ruins with their hands up in ones and twos, and then dozens, and then hundreds. On April 17th, Field Marshal Model walks into a forest near Duisburg, faces east, and shoots himself. He cannot bring himself to surrender. He cannot bring himself to continue. He chooses a third option that closes the last chapter of his command. By April 18th, 317,000 German soldiers are in Allied captivity. It is the largest surrender of German forces on the Western Front in the entire war. The Ruhr, the industrial heart of Germany, the engine that had powered the Wehrmacht for 6 years, is gone. Whitfield reads the final casualty reports from the Ruhr operation in his office at Allied headquarters. American casualties for the encirclement operation total approximately 10,000 killed and wounded, against 317,000 prisoners, a ratio that, by any historical standard of warfare, is extraordinary. His supply projections had held within 4% of actual consumption throughout the entire operation. The broad front advance had worked exactly as the numbers said it would work. He writes nothing down. He files his calculation sheets. He goes back to work. The broader strategic picture is now moving faster than any planning cycle can track. Soviet forces are fighting in the eastern suburbs of Berlin. American forces are at the Elbe River, 80 kilometers to the west. The gap between them is closing at a rate of 5 to 10 kilometers per day from the Soviet side. Eisenhower has ordered the halt. The cable to Stalin has been sent. The decision is made. Churchill cables again. He urges reconsideration. He argues about Prague. He argues about Austria. He argues about the symbolic importance of Western forces being seen to advance as deeply as possible into the heart of the Nazi state before the guns fall silent. Eisenhower is polite. Eisenhower is firm. The plan does not change. On April 25, 1945, American and Soviet soldiers shake hands on the Elbe River at Torgau. They are smiling in the photographs. They are exhausted. Some of them have been fighting continuously since 1941 on the Soviet side, and since 1942 on the American side. They shake hands across a river in a country that has been destroyed, and the war in Europe is effectively, if not yet officially, over. Berlin falls to the Red Army on May 2nd, after 12 days of combat that cost the Soviets over 80,000 killed. It is the bloodiest urban battle in European history. The streets of Berlin become a charnel house. The cost of the city, in human lives, is higher than the total American casualties on the entire Western Front for the last 6 months of the war. Eisenhower's decision not to race for Berlin saves, by General Omar Bradley's own estimate, 100,000 American and British lives. These are not abstract numbers. They are men who came home. On May 4th, 1945, at Lüneburg Heath in northern Germany, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery accepts the unconditional surrender of all German forces in northwestern Germany, the Netherlands, and Denmark. He sits behind a small table in a tent, in his beret with its 2 badges, and receives the signatures of German officers who look like they have not slept in weeks. Montgomery is formal, correct, professional. Whatever personal bitterness he carries about Eisenhower's strategy, about the denied Berlin thrust, about the limitations placed on his command, he keeps entirely to himself in this moment. He signs the document. The fighting stops. 2 million German soldiers lay down their arms. 3 days later, on May 7, 1945, at Reims, France, the unconditional surrender of all German armed forces is signed in Eisenhower's presence. The Supreme Allied Commander stands in a schoolroom that has been converted into a headquarters and watches German officers sign their names to the document that ends the war in Europe. He is 54 years old. He has been in continuous command of the largest military coalition in Western history for almost 3 years. He looks, in the photographs taken that day, like a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and has just been allowed to set it down. He dictates a message to the combined chiefs of staff in Washington and London. It is 8 words long. The mission of this Allied force was fulfilled. He does not mention Montgomery. He does not mention Churchill. He does not mention Berlin. He does not mention the arguments, the cables, the press conferences, the threatened resignations, the private admissions in London offices that some plans were wrong and some plans were right. He states the mission, and he states that it is complete. James Whitfield reads the surrender announcement in a mess hall in Belgium. Around him, men are cheering, embracing, some crying. He sits with his coffee and his calculation sheets and looks at the final numbers. The broad front strategy had consumed, from the Rhine crossing to the German surrender, approximately 4.2 million tons of Allied supplies, delivered across a supply chain stretching over 1,000 kilometers. The actual consumption had deviated from his projections by less than 3%. The operation had proceeded almost exactly as the mathematics said it would proceed. He had been right about Market Garden in September 1944. He had been right about the Rhine crossing in March 1945. He had been right about the Ruhr operation in April 1945. Nobody had ever officially acknowledged this. No medal had been awarded. No commendation had been written. He was a sergeant. Sergeants did not receive credit for being right when generals were involved. He finishes his coffee. He begins preparing his demobilization paperwork. But there is one final chapter to this story. One that happened not in Belgium or Germany or London, but in a small room in Washington in the autumn of 1945, when the war was over and the arguments about how it had been won were just beginning. When the question of what Eisenhower had done right and what Montgomery had done wrong, and what Churchill had admitted in private that he would never fully admit in public, finally came to a reckoning that nobody outside a small circle of men ever knew about. The question of who actually shaped Allied strategy in the final year of the war. The question of whose numbers had mattered. The question of what it means when an ordinary man with a pencil and a calculation sheet turns out to be the most strategically important person in the entire Allied High Command. That answer, and what happened to Sergeant James Whitfield after the war, is part 4. 4 parts, 4 hours of war, distilled into a single question. A logistics sergeant named Whitfield ran the numbers on Market Garden in September 1944 and predicted catastrophe. Nobody listened. 1,400 men died. The Battle of the Bulge nearly broke the alliance. Churchill stood in Parliament and salvaged it with 20 minutes of carefully chosen words. Eisenhower held the broad front, crossed the Rhine, encircled 317,000 Germans in the Ruhr, and accepted the unconditional surrender of the Wehrmacht in a schoolroom in Reims. The war in Europe ended on May 7, 1945. The mission was fulfilled, but the man whose numbers had been right about all of it was sitting in a Belgian mess hall, filling out demobilization paperwork, and nobody was coming to find him. This story has one final chapter, and it contains a truth that most people who study this war never encounter. Because the price of being right when generals are wrong is rarely what you expect it to be. James Whitfield returned to Yorkshire in September 1945. He was 30 years old. He had spent 4 years calculating fuel loads, supply tonnage, and vehicle maintenance schedules for one of the largest military operations in human history. He had predicted the failure of the most famous airborne operation ever launched, submitted the analysis through proper channels, been ignored, watched the operation fail exactly as his mathematics said it would fail, and then continued working as though none of it had happened. He had no medal. He had no commendation. He had a sergeant's final pay packet and a train ticket north. His father was waiting at the station in a town that looked exactly as he had left it. Smaller, somehow, than memory had made it. The workshop behind the house, where he had learned to take apart engines as a boy, was still there, still smelling of oil and metal shavings. His father did not ask many questions about the war. Men of that generation rarely did. They shook hands. They had tea. Life resumed. Whitfield went back to work as a vehicle mechanic. He married in 1947. He had 2 children by 1951. He never spoke publicly about his logistics analysis of Market Garden. He never submitted a memoir. He never contacted a journalist or a historian or a publisher. The 14 pages of calculations that had accurately predicted one of the greatest military disasters in British history sat in a filing cabinet at Allied headquarters in Brussels, were transferred to the British Public Record Office in 1947, and were classified under a standard administrative review for 20 years. The men who had dismissed his report in September 1944 were promoted. Several received decorations. None of them ever publicly acknowledged the analysis existed. This is not unusual. This is, in fact, the standard outcome when institutions make catastrophic errors and individual analysts prove them right. The institution absorbs the failure, redistributes the blame, promotes the survivors, and continues functioning. The analyst goes home on a train, but Whitfield's descent, his actual legacy, was not in any filing cabinet. It was in the doctrine. Because the logistics analysis he had pioneered, the specific methodology of calculating sustainable supply rates against projected consumption on a single axis of advance, became the foundational framework for Allied operational planning in the final year of the war. Not because anyone credited him, but because the methodology worked. And in military planning, what works gets used again. Eisenhower's staff, the American logistics officers who had read Whitfield's single-page summary in September 1944, incorporated his calculation framework into every subsequent major operational plan. The Rhine crossing planning used it. The Ruhr encirclement planning used it. The final advance to the Elbe used it. After the war, the U.S. Army's operational logistics doctrine was comprehensively revised. The new framework, published in 1947 as part of the Army's formal doctrinal update, established what planners called the Sustainable Advance Ratio, a method of calculating whether a proposed advance could be logistically supported over time before committing forces. The framework required planners to calculate maximum sustainable supply delivery on any given axis, compare it against minimum required consumption for the proposed operation, and refuse to approve any plan where the gap exceeded 15%. Market Garden had failed with a gap of 60%. The new doctrine was designed to ensure that no commander could ever again approve an operation that the numbers said was impossible. That doctrine was used in Korea. It was used in Vietnam. Modified versions of it are embedded in NATO operational planning today. Every major Western military alliance that has conducted sustained ground operations in the past 70 years has used a version of the sustainable advance calculation that a Yorkshire mechanic's son worked out by hand at a desk in Belgium in the summer of 1944. Whitfield never knew this. Or rather, he knew pieces of it, glimpsed through fragments in military journals he occasionally read in the 1950s and 1960s, without ever seeing his own name or recognizing his specific methodology explicitly credited. The framework had been absorbed into institutional practice and stripped of its origin, the way all genuinely useful ideas eventually are. The deeper lesson here is not about logistics. It is about the specific, recurring failure of institutions to listen to people who are right when being right is inconvenient. Montgomery's plan for Market Garden was not rejected because the numbers looked wrong. It was embraced because the narrative was compelling. A bold thrust, a British hero, the war over by Christmas, speed and glory replacing the grinding, slow advance. Every person in the room who approved that operation understood, on some level, that the logistics were problematic. Whitfield was not the only person who had doubts. He was simply the only person who wrote them down clearly enough that the doubts could not be dismissed as timidity or excessive caution. He had made the problem visible. And making a problem visible, when powerful people have already committed to ignoring it, is not a path to recognition. It is a path to being very quietly sidelined. This pattern is not unique to 1944. It appears in every organization that has ever existed. The analyst who models the risk and finds it catastrophic. The engineer who calculates the failure probability and submits the report. The officer who runs the numbers and concludes the plan cannot work. These people are consistently overruled by the weight of narrative, by the momentum of commitment, by the social cost of telling a powerful person that their bold idea is built on a foundation that will not hold. And the institutions that learn to listen to them, that build formal mechanisms for taking the inconvenient numbers seriously before the operation launches, rather than after the casualties arrive, are the institutions that win. Eisenhower's genius was not tactical. It was organizational. He created, over the course of 3 years of coalition command, a planning culture in which the American logistics staff felt empowered to push back on operational proposals that exceeded sustainable supply capacity. He did not always succeed. Market Garden succeeded in overriding that culture, partly because of the political pressure from Churchill and Montgomery, partly because the narrative of a quick victory was too seductive to resist entirely. But after Market Garden, after the numbers proved right and the bodies were counted, the culture shifted. The logistics analysis became harder to dismiss. The sustainable advance ratio became mandatory. The lesson was institutionalized. That is the real legacy, not the medals, not the commendations, the doctrine. Now here is the detail that almost nobody knows. The one that closes the story in a way that feels, in retrospect, almost too precise to be coincidental. In 1974, the British Public Record Office released a batch of declassified documents from Allied headquarters, covering the period August through October 1944. Among them was Whitfield's original 14-page logistics analysis of Market Garden, complete with his signature and his unit designation. A junior historian named Michael Foote, working on a study of Allied operational planning, found it while going through the files. He recognized immediately what it was. He read it twice. He checked the dates. The analysis was dated September 3rd, 1944. Market Garden launched on September 17th. The report had been submitted, received, read by a senior staff officer, and filed without action 14 days before the operation began. Foote wrote a short note in his research diary, which was later published as part of a broader academic collection in 1981. The note reads, in its entirety, that the analysis was accurate in all material respects, that its conclusions were never acted upon, and that had the operation been cancelled or redesigned on the basis of this document, the British 1st Airborne Division would not have been destroyed at Arnhem. The note attracted almost no attention when it was published. Military historians were focused on larger questions. The popular literature of Market Garden was dominated by Cornelius Ryan's book and the film that followed it, both of which focused on the airborne soldiers and their extraordinary courage, which was real and deserved every word written about it. The logistics analysis of a sergeant from Yorkshire did not fit that narrative. It was filed and forgotten again. Whitfield died in 1987 at the age of 72. His obituary in a local Yorkshire newspaper noted his service in the Second World War and his career as a vehicle mechanic. It did not mention Market Garden. It did not mention the 14 pages. His family, when contacted by a researcher in the early 2000s, confirmed that he had never discussed his wartime analysis work with them. His wife recalled that he occasionally read military history books in the evenings, and that he once, near the end of his life, put one of them down and said something she did not understand at the time. He said that the problem with history is that it always remembers the men who were wrong loudly and forgets the men who were right quietly. From a Yorkshire mechanic's son with 14 pages of calculations to a foundational principle of Western military logistics doctrine used by every major NATO ground operation for the past 70 years. James Whitfield proved that the most strategically important person in a military coalition is sometimes the one nobody remembers. The broad front strategy that Eisenhower maintained, the strategy that kept the alliance intact, that delivered the Ruhr encirclement, that brought 317,000 German soldiers into captivity at a cost of 10,000 Allied casualties, that ended the war in Europe without fracturing the most consequential military partnership in modern history. That strategy worked in part because its logistical foundations were sound. And those foundations were sound, in part, because one man had done the arithmetic and refused to pretend the numbers said something they did not say. Over 8 million people died in the European theater of the Second World War. The decisions made in the autumn of 1944 about how to advance, how fast, on which axis, with what logistical support, affected how many of those 8 million were in that final count. The number we cannot calculate. The number that exists only as a possibility rather than a fact, is how many people did not die because Eisenhower held the broad front,